Hello, you've tuned into State of South Asia, a podcast from Himal Southasian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Nayantara Narayanan. In early March this year, a massive gathering of some 10,000 royalist supporters gathered to greet Nepal's former king, Gyanendra Bir Bikram Shah, as he returned to the capital Kathmandu from the city of Pokhara. The rally had political observers in Kathmandu wondering whether there was a possibility at all of a return of the monarchy in Nepal. Later in the month, on Friday the 28th, a similar pro-royalist rally in Kathmandu turned violent. The pro-monarchy protesters torched the office of the Nepal Communist Party Unified Socialist, attempted to burn down the office of Nepal's main Maoist party, looted a department store, and destroyed numerous vehicles. 2 people were killed. One was a driver who, by all accounts, was just a bystander and who was shot by security forces as he tried to flee the scene. Another was a TV journalist who died after being trapped inside one of the buildings that was set on fire. Some Nepali commentators see the pro-monarchy movement and the resulting violence on Friday, the 28th of March, as a sign of discontent with the state of the country's politics and economy. But in a recent piece for Himal, Amish Raj Mulmi argues that Nepal is doing better than it did during the monarchy and that the protests reveal Nepal's incomplete transition from a Hindu kingdom to a secular republic. Nationalist myths and India's Hindu right also feed into this royalist resurgence. On this episode, I am joined by Pranaya Rana, who is a journalist and a political analyst in Kathmandu, to talk about this royalist resurgence, the events of the 28th of March, and what happens next. Pranay, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Nandara.
So, Pranay, let's begin with what happened on that day, the 28th of March, which was a Friday. You have a newsletter called Kalam Weekly, which is a current affairs newsletter about Nepal. You were putting that together that week when this riot occurred in Kathmandu. How were you first alerted to the fact that something was happening, and how did things unfold that day?
So, me, like most others, we found out through social media. That's generally how things go these days. From the very morning, it was evident that there was going to be a large rally. I myself saw a few hundred protesters or demonstrators taking to the streets, heading to where the main event was going to be held. But by around noon and right after noon, all these images, videos started to appear on social media of what was happening there, and it did not look like a good sight. There was a lot of tear gas, there were a lot of stone throwing from the protesters to the police, and the police were responding with tear gas. There were, baton charges. So we kind of saw what was happening on social media, and I think that's because a lot of major mainstream media from Nepal were not present at the protest or the demonstration. It was quite disappointing and also a little surprising that such a large demonstration was not really covered adequately by the mainstream media. So we had to rely on social media to figure out what was happening and how things were unfolding, which is also what has now led to a lot of conspiracy theories, misinformation regarding what happened, how things happened, who instigated the violence or who started the violence. So yeah, I think a lot of us did not expect that things would turn out the way they did. So maybe that's why a lot of journalists were not present. But at least we found out basically through, TikTok, Twitter. That's really our source.
So the reason that mainstream media wasn't there is simply because of the pace of events. Things unfolded so quickly that mainstream channels couldn't get there on time.
I mean, it seems like it because usually when there are large demonstrations like this, the mainstream media outlets generally deploy, at least a few journalists or, TV reporters there to cover what's happening. This time, I didn't see much of that happening. There were a few TV journalists there, but, major mainstream media outlets, like some of our biggest media outlets, did not have any journalists there. Perhaps because they didn't expect that anything interesting was going to happen or maybe they downplayed the extent of the demonstration, like how large it was going to be or what was going to happen. And once the violence and once things started to get out of control, I don't think the journalists really felt that it was necessary to be there, right where it was happening, because a lot of the journalists were also being, attacked by the demonstrators. So there was also a security issue. So I guess it was maybe a combination of things.
Pranay, tell us a little bit about who the leaders of this protest were and what their backgrounds are. Starting, of course, with the former king Gyanendra Bir Bikram Shah, who wasn't there on the day, but there is some background to his role in how things escalated, right?
So Gyanendra Shah, yes, he was our last monarch. He stepped down in 2006, 2007 after the popular movement against his autocratic rule. Since then, he's kind of laid low, but I think that now he's felt like, the time has come for him to make a reappearance. So, like you mentioned earlier, there was this large welcome rally to welcome him back when he came from Pokhara. That was not planned. I mean, it was semi-planned. It was largely, a spontaneous kind of gathering. And I think he was very taken aback by that, maybe surprised, but also probably pleased that he has such a large following, especially in Kathmandu, the capital. So since then, he has been in discussions with a few leaders of this movement to, take this pro-royalist, pro-monarchy movement forward. The leaders of this movement, I should mention first and foremost, has been a man named Durga Prasad. He's a wealthy businessman who owns and operates a medical college in Chapa, which is in the plains of Nepal. He has a very checkered past. He is a very controversial businessman. He was once very close to our current Prime Minister, KP Sharma Oli, and the Maoist chairman, Pushpakamal Dal Prachanda. So the three of them were at one time very close. They had good, great relations. Durga Prasad was solidly on their side. But in recent years, he's broken away with them over issues like he wanted to open a new college, but the government of the time did not give him a license. So he's been displeased with that. He has a lot of outstanding bank loans that he wants forgiven, and he's trying to get the political parties to pressure the banks to forgive his loans, but they're not doing that either. So he has now switched sides, and now he's completely turned royalist, and he has really used his social media clout to gather large demonstrations to bring people together and you know get to the streets and demonstrate to bring back the monarchy and get Nepal back to being a Hindu state. So he met with Gyanendra a few days before the March 28th rally, and he got Gyanendra's blessings to take the movement forward. He was also designated the field commander of the demonstrations. So there's him. Then there are a few. So he's the main primary leader or convener of all these demonstrations. But there are also a few other actors who should be mentioned. For instance, there is a man named Rabindra Mishra, who is a member of the pro-royalist Rashtriya Prajatantra Party, the National Democracy Party. So he's a former BBC journalist who entered politics as an alternative. So he started a party that was called the Saja Party. Then he joined with another alternative party called Vivekshil Party to form Vivekshil Saja. For a long time, he advocated for alternative politics. But then he also turned royalist and joined the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party and has been at the forefront of these demonstrations. He was there in the field during Friday's demonstration. He was on stage, he was making speeches, he was also trying to kind of control the crowd, talking to them. So there's Ravindra Mishra, there's Durga Prasad, but one other interesting actor who Amish also pointed out in his essay for Himal is Manisha Koirala, who is the very popular Bollywood actress. She is the granddaughter of BP Koirala, Nepal's first democratically elected prime minister. And she has really been active on social media. She is very supportive of the monarchy, and she really believes that Nepal should go back to being a Hindu kingdom. She also has used her considerable social media influence to play up the monarchist movement, to ask people to join the demonstrations, and has spoken out in support of the movement. So these are most of the primary actors. There's also a few others who have been involved in the movement but weren't really there during the demonstrations and have kind of taken a backseat to Durga Prasad and Ravindra Mishra. For example, there's a man named Rajendra Lingden who actually leads the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party, but he has not been very, very active. He has not physically joined the movement, and he's allowed Durga Prasad and Ravindra Mishra to lead for the time being.
Right. And Durga Prasad also kind of fled the scene. I think there have been calls for his arrest. He has been absconding since then. What is the latest on that?
It's very interesting because he was there during the rally. The government really says that it was he who instigated all of the violence. Because there is literally a video of him in his vehicle driving very aggressively towards the security cordon, almost trying to run them down and trying to break through, then yelling at all of the supporters to, break through, follow him, let's go, let's go. He's instigating the crowd. So he was there right when the violence was taking place. But then somehow he managed to escape without the police arresting him. And since then, he's been on the run. The police apparently, the security forces apparently don't know where he is. Since then, he's also released another video on social media saying, his life is under threat. He fears that he is going to be murdered by the Nepal government if he gives himself up. So he's not going to do that. So the police and the security forces believe that he's either in the Nepali Tarai or he's in India hiding out until things get over, or if he can
Mm.
strike a political deal with the political parties to not get arrested or to take the monarchy movement forward. So he's still hiding out.
Right. Seems like controversial businessmen are all over the news right now, from across South Asia to the United States. But anyway, it's been almost 20 years since Nepal made that transition from a monarchy to a democratic republic. But Gyanendra actually throughout has kind of held out hope of a return to power as the king. And been making many comments over the years to that effect. Tell us a little more about that.
Well, Gyanendra, every year he addresses his former uh, citizens or his praja through a video message on the occasion of Democracy Day. It's interesting because Democracy Day in Nepali, Prajatantra Divas, when you have a praja, you have a raja, and then you have a praja. We also have a Republic Day, and Republic Day in Nepali is Ganatantra Divas. So there is Prajatantra and Ganatantra. Ganatantra is when you have just the people without a king. So that's Prajatantra, you have a raja and a praja. So this is what he chooses to do every year on Prajatantra Divas. He gives a message expressing disappointment with the direction the country is heading in, and he's usually quite oblique about his criticisms. He doesn't really make anything explicit. He doesn't criticize anyone directly. But this year, his address was a little different because this time he actively called on the people to support him in maintaining national unity and taking Nepal forward. So he said that kind of ominously that the time has come for him to, I guess, come back into politics. So the monarchists and his supporters kind of saw that as a call to action. They're like, okay, he's finally doing it. He's finally making his move. So that was what led to the early March welcome in Kathmandu. But Gyanendra, he's always been quite inscrutable. Even when he was king, he was not very vocal. He was not very public with his comments, with how he felt. He didn't consult very many people, and he always, maintained a very small circle of advisors, many of whom he didn't listen to. He has a reputation for being very stubborn and kind of set in his ways and how he does things. So over the years, yes, it does seem like he has always held out this desire to re-enter politics and maybe come back as king. But it wasn't very evident until now.
I'm just going to take a quick moment for a message to our listeners. Himal has been covering Nepal and the rest of South Asia for more than 35 years. We bring you cross border stories that you won't find anywhere else. It takes a lot to do this kind of in depth, independent journalism, and we rely on listeners like you. You can support the magazine by becoming a paying patron. Click on the link in the episode notes or go to our website himalmag.com and click Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletter to keep up with Himal's stories, events, and more. Now back to our conversation with Pranaya Rana. Pranay, I'm going to ask you now to give us a brief history of the system of rule in Nepal, from the Ranas to the Shahs and the Panchayat system to multi-party democracy in 2006. What did each of these phases signify for the people of Nepal in terms of how they were governed and the freedoms that they had?
Well, Nepali history, like the history of almost every country, is very, very complicated. Nepal was basically came together as a modern nation state in the late 1700s. Prithvi Narayan Shah, the founder of this country, came from Gorkha, this small principality, this city state, really, and expanded all throughout what is now modern Nepal and even parts of India that were eventually given back. But the Shah dynasty, of which Gyanendra is the last monarch, was established in the late 1700s, and they have been pretty much ruling Nepal until now. But there have been ups and downs. The Shah dynasty really took a backseat in the 1800s when the Rana dynasty came to power. The Ranas were they were prime ministers, but they were essentially the power behind the throne. The king, the Shah king at the time, was basically just a figurehead who had no power. The Rana dynasty was established by a man named Jangabahadur Rana, and his descendants is not his direct descendants, but his brothers and his brothers' children basically ruled Nepal for 104 years as shadow rulers. They were prime ministers. So in Nepal, the king is called Shri Panch. So the Shri, 5 times. But the Ranas dubbed themselves Shri Teen, meaning Shri, 3 times. So although they did say that the king is still the king, but we're also powerful. We also deserve some kind of Shri. So that 104 years was basically a dynastic autocracy where the people were extremely impoverished. No one had any access to any civil liberties. The common people could not even get an education. Everything was basically limited to the Ranas and their uh, near and dear ones. The Ranas, where they enriched themselves. They basically used the country as their own personal piggy bank. They lived very, very lavish lives, while the people were very extremely poor. But the Rana regime fell in 1950 during a popular movement. It was a popular but also an armed movement that was led by the Nepali Congress. And that happened right in the wake of India's independence movement. So the Nepali Congress was greatly influenced by the Indian National Congress. Many members of the Nepali Congress fought alongside Indian freedom fighters in India, learned a lot from them, and then came back to Nepal and decided that the Rana time was over, and Nepalis also deserved democracy. So they fought for that. They were supported by India, and then the regime eventually fell in the 1950s, and then Nepal got our first taste of democracy. But that democracy was very short-lived. In just less than 10 years, the new king, which was Mahendra, At the time, he was the father of both Birendra and Gyanendra. Mahendra basically seized power in a coup. He dissolved all of the political parties and established a party-less system that was called the panchayat. So there would be a national panchayat council, there would be district level panchayats and village level panchayats, which would basically decide how things happen. They would act as informal rule of law. This was basically an experiment with direct democracy or direct rule that Mahendra instituted. It ran for about 30 years, from 1960 to 1990. That period was once again marked by very limited civil liberties. There was basically no freedom of speech. Even though Mahendra was not as terrible as the Ranas, he still exercised a great deal of control over what citizens could do, what citizens could say. The political parties were all basically banned. But Mahendra also embarked on a very nationalist campaign to unify Nepal's very, very diverse communities under one national identity, which was basically a Hindu identity, Hinduism as the national religion, as the state religion, but also a very cultural kind of identity for Nepal, which was basically based on the hill identity. So in Nepal, we have most of our population lives in the plains and in the hills. The mountains are very sparsely populated. The hilly region is basically where most of the ruling communities, basically the Brahmins, the Kshatris, they come from the hills. So Mahendra prioritized the hill identity over the Tarai plains, which are home to more recent migrants from India who are Nepalis, but whose identity and whose cultural practices are very different from what the Pahadi, the hill Nepalis kind of celebrate or are, how they are culturally. So there was that. That all happened until 1990, when then in 1990 there was another popular movement to topple the panchayat and bring back democracy. The movement again was successful, and the king at the time, Mahendra's son Birendra, was in power. Birendra was seen as a very, gentleman king, who was, and he basically gave power back to the people. There was a new constitution, and Birendra took more of a backseat as a constitutional monarch. And now we had multi-party democracy back in Nepal. That lasted 15 years or so until Birendra, as I'm sure most listeners will know, there was a royal massacre in 2001, and Birendra's entire family was killed. Exactly. That's when Gyanendra came back. Gyanendra became the next king, and in 4 years of becoming king, Gyanendra basically did what his father had done, dissolving all the political parties, seizing power, and becoming basically an autocrat. And that again lasted for another couple of years. That was in 2005, another 1 or 2 years of direct rule of Gyanendra, but he was again toppled by another popular movement in 2006 that was led by the seven mainstream political parties and the Maoists, who were, Maoist rebels who had been waging an insurgency for the past 10 years. Since 1996 to 2006, Nepal was in the midst of a major civil conflict that had started out in far west Nepal, but had really expanded to all over Nepal by the early 2000s. And that was what initially Birendra was fighting against, and then Gyanendra seized power to quell the insurgency because he thought that the political parties were not doing a good enough job. And that now brings us to today, where now we have no monarchy. We're back to being a multi-party secular republic, and now we have a movement that is trying to bring back the king again.
Right. And the question also about the return of the monarchy is also because this is such a young republic, right? Not even 20 years old. But, like I mentioned earlier, some people have said that the reason for this royalist resurgence, for these rallies, the pro-monarchy movement that even resulted in this riot, is some kind of discontent with the status quo, that is in Nepal's political and economic system right now. But this may not quite be the case, right? How do you see it, Pranay?
I mean, it is always, always a combination of factors. You can't I don't think we can definitively say that this is the sole reason. So yes, I mean, discontent is
Mhm.
playing a large part. So I would not dismiss the real discontent that a lot of Nepalis feel against the current dispensation, the current administration, the way the Nepal is currently being ruled by the three major political parties, which are, the Nepali Congress, the United Marxist-Leninists, and the Maoists. I would not dismiss discontent as a major contributing factor, but there are, of course, a lot of other reasons. For instance, there is a global rightward shift that is happening, that is underway, and Nepal is not immune from any of that. We have that in South Asia, we have that in the US, we're seeing that everywhere, where democracies are backsliding, and the kind of a progressive spirit that was there in the recent past has really been is being undercut by all of these right-wing conservative movements that are now rising. That is also playing out in Nepal. The monarchy is a very conservative institution. We are not going forward, we're going backwards. And that is also happening here. So that is all that there is a role that has to play here too, the global shift in politics and the way things are going. But there is also, just simple things like political opportunism. There are a lot of political actors who see this as an opportune time to make their move. People like Ravindra Mishra, who have been largely discredited and who do not have a large political base. The Rashtriya Prajatantra Party just has a few dozen seats in parliament, although they claim that a majority of Nepal supports them. So they see this as the right time to make their move. This is now when they can, really get the movement going, and then in the next elections, maybe get more votes. And then there are people like Durga Prasad who are instigating things just for their personal financial political gain. Durga Prasad, I really do not believe has any political ideology. He's an opportunist, and he sees this as a way to gain power, to become an influential actor in how things are going to evolve from now on. So those are all coming, all of these factors are coming together. So it isn't either or. It's basically a combination of all of these factors coming together. Um, the discontent that you mentioned, I was at that rally when Gyanendra came back from Pokhara. I did speak to a bunch of young, very young people who were there at the rally. Many of them did not really profess a deep desire for the monarchy. Their complaints were really against the three parties that rule Nepal today. A lot of the slogans that they were chanting were against Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli or the leader of the Nepali Congress, Sherbadur Deuba. There were all of these. This sloganeering was happening not just to say the king is great, but these political parties are bad. So there is that. So I mean, yes, it's not the only factor, but I don't think we should really dismiss it and say that no, things are great. Things are not really great. Yes, metrically, if we look at any metric, Nepal is doing better now. Every single metric, HDI, literacy rate, maternal mortality, infant mortality, everything. Nepal is better. Nepal is richer now. The middle class is growing. We are so much better today than we were even just 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But all of these changes have to be felt by the people, and that's what's not happening. If it was, we wouldn't have a million Nepalis leaving Nepal every single year. We wouldn't have 1,000 Nepalis leaving every single day for work abroad. So we can say, yes, metrics are great. You should be happy with that. But if people are not getting jobs, if people are not feeling like this is where I have a chance at a good life, they would be leaving. And they are.
They'd be leaving or they'd be looking for another system to take
Mhm.
the place of this one that's not working for them, right?
Exactly.
But what does the pro monarchy movement or even some kind of return of the monarchy mean for the people of the plains and the ethnic minorities in Nepal?
Personally, I know there is a fear among many progressives in Nepal that a return to the monarchy would mean, once again this Hindu hill identity being prioritized or being, promoted over every other identity that Nepal has. Nepal is a very, very, very diverse country, and we do not, most people do not want a single overarching identity that says that this is what it means to be a Nepali.
Mm.
That happened during the Panchayat, during the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. I don't see that happening again. In the years since, we've had, the Maoist movement. We've had multiple movements in the Madhes, the Tarai Plains. There are all of these have been movements for identity, for representation, for inclusion, and the kind of consciousness that they've brought into the Nepali mainstream is not going to go back. The ethnic minorities today who are so much more aware of their rights, of who they are as a people, of representation, of inclusion, all of that have become established agendas in the Nepali public sphere, in the Nepali consciousness. And that, just a monarch coming back again, the king coming back again is not going to erase that. And the Madhesis, the ethnic minorities, the indigenous, the Dalits, the Tharus, they're not going to simply lay down and allow the monarchy to run roughshod over them. There will be movement. If the monarchy ever comes back, there is going to be, significant opposition to whatever the monarchy tries to do. So I'm really not afraid. I'm not afraid that, we're going to lose so much of the gains that we've had because the Nepal people are resilient. Nepal people are way more aware of who they are as a people today than they were 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Pranay, I want to come to the role of India or actors from India. So the Shahs have had a relationship with the Gorakhnath Mutt, which is a temple in India, in the state of Uttar Pradesh. The current head of the Mutt is Ajay Bisht, more popularly known as Yogi Adityanath, who is the Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh and also considered to be Prime Minister Narendra Modi's successor. Adityanath and Modi belong to the Bharatiya Janata Party, whose ideological parent is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh or the RSS. Adityanath also subscribes to a very hardline Hindutva, which is a Hindu supremacist ideology. And there were people, in the rally that greeted Gyanendra when he came back to Kathmandu, actually carrying Adityanath's posters. Uh, Tell us a little more about this relationship between the Shahs and the Gorakhnath Mutt and the interest of the RSS in seeing a Hindu monarchy in Nepal.
Yes, so the Gorakhnath is basically the Nepali monarchy's patron deity. It's basically their go-to god. And there is a long, long history to this. There are apocryphal stories of Gorakhnath, Guru Gorakhnath, who apparently came to Nepal and is supposed to have blessed Prithvi Narayan Shah, his campaign of conquest. Of course, this is apocryphal. There is really no evidence that this actually happened, but it persists. This legend persists. Of course, Prithvi Narayan Shah and the Shah monarchy, their home, where they came from, is the city-state of Gorkha, and Gorkha is named after Gorakhnath. So this relationship between Gorakhnath and the Shah monarchy goes back, many, many hundreds of years. And the kings have always been very close to the Gorakhnath Mutt. They periodically have always visited, Uttar Pradesh. They've had good relations with the chief priest, the Mahant of the Gorakhnath Mutt. And Gyanendra himself has visited Adityanath multiple times. So Gyanendra's before Adityanath, his predecessor Avoidanath was also very close to Gyanendra and Gyanendra's brother Birendra. The two of them were, they visited often, and they also the Shah monarchy also patronizes the Gorakhnath Mutt with finances and a lot of support. Adityanath, for his part, has also professed publicly his desire to see Nepal go back to being a Hindu state. He's spoken about that publicly, even though it should be noted that he hasn't really publicly commented on Nepal being a Hindu kingdom per se. He has said a Hindu state, but not a Hindu kingdom. And I think that's very important to note. Because there is, even though the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, is, you know, the patron of the BJP, I think the two's goals are slightly different when it comes to Nepal and when it comes to the monarchy in Nepal. The BJP, as the ruling party and as the government, I think is a bit more skeptical of the monarchy because the monarchs have never had a very good relationship with India, or at least the Indian government. The monarchs, starting all the way from Mahendra, have always had a very, very, antagonistic relationship with the Indian government. Uh, Even while they've cultivated, ground level organizations like the RSS and the Vishwa Hindu Parishad and many other, slightly right-wing Hindutva-based organizations. Mahendra, when he was embarking on this whole Hindu identity for Nepal, was very opposed to the Indian government at the time. Nehru, who was uh, a, a secular socialist, was against Mahendra's campaign. And Mahendra did not see eye to eye with the Congress leaders and the secularists of in India at that time. So what he did was he cultivated the RSS, and the RSS supported him uh, in his campaign to make Nepal a Hindu kingdom. For the RSS, Nepal is their fantasy come true. What they and even Prithvi Narayan Shah at one point called an Asli Hindustan, a Hindu state that has never been corrupted by the by Muslim invaders or Western colonization. Basically, a pure land that is majority Hindu, that has its own traditions and culture, and it has kept that unsullied by outside influence. So that's what the RSS wants. And for the RSS, the monarchy is important. The RSS at multiple points have designated both Birendra and Gyanendra Vishwa Hindu Samrat, basically a world leader, Hindu leader. But again, the RSS and the BJP are slightly, they have different objectives here. Um, I would not really read too much into Adityanath's poster being raised at that welcome rally for Gyanendra. It was done by one private businessman who has since escaped to the Tarai Plain and to India, and he's now saying that he's being persecuted by the Nepali state for having that poster. I think it was more of a private thing that this one person did rather than an institutional acknowledgement of Adityanath's
Hmm.
support for the monarchy. Um,
Of course, across South Asia, there's been so much change in the last few years. About 3 years ago, we had this big revolution in Sri Lanka, which, the Aragalaya. Last year, we had the monsoon revolution in Bangladesh. Have these kind of played into the narrative of the pro-royalist forces in Nepal? Have they adopted these stories of revolution to kind of saying they're bringing some kind of change, positive change to Nepal?
no, I don't really see that. At least not on a large scale. Though there are, some people do say that the demonstrations in Nepal right now are reflective of this, the kind of discontent in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka against the ruling parties, the
Right.
the ruling administration. So they do try to connect it, but it's not a major narrative here. Here, Nepal is really not looking outward, but is looking inward and towards the past, towards what they see as an idealized past when Nepal was, I guess, developing and when the monarch really held a lot of power and did not have to. What they say these days is that our political parties are really beholden to foreign interests, majorly India, and to a lesser extent China. So a lot of the pro-monarchists today, rather than looking outwards, they're looking inwards and they're looking towards the past to a time when the monarchy had or commanded some sort of respect, not just internally, but on the global stage. A lot of these pro-monarchists tend to share images of the monarchs being, welcomed by world leaders, for instance, in the US or in India, and afforded with some kind of respect that they don't see the political parties of today receiving from, from countries like India, really.
Okay, so coming back briefly to the 28th of March and how the security forces reacted that day, you wrote in your newsletter that they must also acknowledge their role in not curbing the violence and for letting it escalate to the level that it did. How much responsibility, in your view, do they bear for what happened that day?
A significant amount of blame must rest with the security forces. This is not something new in Nepal. The security forces have never been great. They are poorly trained and they often respond with disproportionate force, especially when the protesters are either indigenous people, minorities, or Modesis. This time it happened in the capital. But it really does seem like the forces on the ground were perhaps ordered to respond with overwhelming force, no matter what happened. Because if you look at the police's own numbers that they've released, they've fired over 800 canisters of tear gas. They fired over 50 rounds of live ammunition. These are insane numbers to fire at a crowd that is maybe 5,000 people in the span of just a few hours, and to shoot with live ammunition into a crowd indiscriminately, injuring so many bystanders. So now the reports are coming out in the media of all the people who've been shot by the security forces, and the vast majority of them are bystanders who were either caught up in the demonstration or who were not even doing anything but just trying to get into their homes. They've been shot. And this is a gross, big failing on the part of the security forces. No matter what happened, we must remember that the demonstrators were armed with rocks. No one was firing bullets at the security forces. So, by any account, this is disproportionate use of force. And two people are dead. One of them was shot in the chest, and videos have been released of this man who was not a protester, was caught up in the movement. And there is a video that shows him basically retreating and going away from the security forces. There is a huge gap between the police and the demonstrators, and still the police chose to fire at them and basically murdered this man. So they must bear responsibility for this. And we cannot give them a pass just because the monarchists are not palatable to a large section of Nepal's intelligentsia, or like the public commentators, or Nepal's progressives don't want the monarchy back again. I don't want the monarchy back again. But that doesn't mean I'm going to allow the security forces to run roughshod over people who were protesting, people who maybe got out of hand. Yes, there was a mob, there was vandalism, there was arson, but that doesn't mean the security forces should have been shooting to kill.
Right. So, how does Nepal go ahead, and how should Nepal go ahead from here, in your view?
I don't know. I really I am not one who tries to predict what happens in Nepal, because that's a fool's errand. Things change so rapidly, so fast in Nepal, that you can never really tell how things are going to play out. But I would say that the security, I mean, not the security forces, the administration, the KP government is trying to arrest everyone. There have been calls to arrest Gyanendra and even maybe exile him from the country. I feel that would be a big mistake, because that would just turn Gyanendra into a martyr. that would give his supporters even more fuel to accuse the government of overreach, of saying you are just jailing this guy when he has done nothing wrong. So the only way really to oppose the monarchy is to become better Democrats, better Republicans. That's really the only way. And that's not going to happen today, tomorrow, or in the next month, even. It's going to really take years. And I don't know if we have years, but the attempt should be made. The political parties really, really do need to do some introspection and see why is this happening? Where have we gone wrong? And the people will tell they will say you are corrupt. You are very inefficient. In the nearly 20 years since we've had a republic, Nepal has had how many governments so far? 14 governments.
Mhm.
Political instability is has become just the way things are done, and that doesn't sit well with the Nepali people. And the only way you can nip this monarchy movement right now in the bud, because it is really still in the bud, is to be honest with the people about where you failed and pledge to do better. Maybe translate that into action by stepping down. We've had the same prime minister 5 times. Sher Bahadur Deuba of the Nepali Congress. He's been prime minister 5 times. And he's even now, in waiting to become prime minister for the sixth time. And people ask, well, what did you do? What did you do for this country in those 5 times as prime minister? And why should we accept you as prime minister for the sixth time again? So maybe they need to think of that too. They need to really look inwards and figure out what they can do. Maybe it's time for the our leaders, the mainstream political leaders who are all in their 70s, to hand over the reins of the party to the next generation of leaders. And that would be a step towards at least showing the Nepali people that we hear you and we are trying to do something. So yeah, that needs to happen. But if there is business as usual, if they just continue to ignore or dismiss this pro-monarchy movement, it's just going to grow.
Well, Pranay, my final question to you. I'm going to ask you for three recommendations. These could be books or movies or other podcasts, something that will help listeners understand what's going on in Nepal right now and, the political history of Nepal that's brought us to this point.
Mhm. Yes, so I have thought about this, and of course, three recommendations, quite difficult, but I think, okay, let me start with the oldest recommendation, which is a book it's called The Blood-Stained Throne. And it's a history of the Shah dynasty and basically all the bloody struggles for power that have taken place in Nepal's history. It is a very entertaining read. It's a translation of a Nepali book called Aba Yesto Kaile Nahos, which basically means let this never happen again. And it's a book by Baburam Acharya, who was Nepal's most eminent historian. It provides a great background for the Shah dynasty, how it progressed and how it regressed over the centuries. And it's a very entertaining read. It's the struggles for power are so bloody and just so entertaining to read that it's like a Nepali version of Game of Thrones. Um, so that's my first recommendation. Then, second, I would recommend a book called Prayogshala, or which means laboratory in Nepali. It's been translated into English as the Nepal Nexus. It's a book by a journalist and editor of Nepal's biggest Nepali newspaper, Kantipur. His name is Sudhir Sharma. He's a great journalist. He's a great archivist, and this book is details the many ways in which the Indian establishment, particularly Raw, have influenced Nepali politics. It's an insider's look, and it's very entertaining. It's very well written. It reads like a thrilling spy story, and it provides a primer on just how much of Nepali politics and the direction that Nepal has taken over the years have been influenced and often dictated by outside interests, especially the Indian establishment and Indian spies. Um, so that's another recommendation. My last recommendation is a film that recently came out. It's called Raja Ganj or Puja Sar. Uh, it's a film by a Nepali filmmaker named Deepak Raunier, and it's set in the Madhesh during the Madhesh protests against the 2015 or Nepal's most recent constitution. It's a detective story. It follows um, a female inspector from the hills who travels to the Madhesh to investigate the kidnapping of two young boys. And it unfolds like a police procedural, but it is a very nuanced and complicated look at the very at the relationship between Nepal's hills and Nepal's plains and the people who live there. I think it's a very, very well made movie. Anurag Kashyap is also an executive producer. I think he's also spoken out in favor of this movie that I think most people should see it, especially Nepalis. But if you would like to understand how the dynamics between Nepal's hill population, Nepal's Tarai population, I think this is a great film to watch. And it's recently come out. I don't know if it's in theaters in parts of South Asia, but it should be available soon.
Super. Thank you for those recommendations, Pranay. And thank you so much for joining me on this episode and giving us the lowdown on Nepali politics.
Thank you, Nandara. I hope it was insightful.
Thanks a lot. That was Pranaya Rana on the State of South Asia podcast. Go to our website, himalmag.com, to read more on Nepal's politics, including Amish Mulmi's latest piece on the incomplete end to Nepal's Hindu monarchy. You can also read Abha Lal's profile of C.K. Raut, a leader of the Madhes movement. You'll find the link to those stories and many more in the episode notes. Don't forget to tune in to the South Asia Review of Books podcast next week, where Shweta Srikantan will be talking to Rahul Bhatia on his book New India, The Unmaking of the World's Largest Democracy. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes, and you can share, rate, and review them. You can also sign up for our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nandara Narayanan. Thank you for listening and see you then.